Security will run out of money to care for children and families at the border who are already held in deplorable, chaotic conditions, often without needed medical care or even soap and toothbrushes. Children go without showers or clean clothes for weeks. 7 and 8-year-olds care for infants they don't know, while toddlers go without diapers. This is heartbreaking and, in the richest country on earth, unacceptable. This bill totals $4.5 billion for basic human needs and better care. It includes $200 million for an integrated multi-agency processing center pilot program with nonprofits, as well as $60 million to assist local entities and nonprofits serving the influx of migrants. The president's cruel immigration policies that tear apart families and terrorize communities demand the stringent safeguards in this bill to ensure these funds are used for humanitarian needs only, not for immigration raids, not detention beds, not a border wall. This bill would better protect migrants' rights and dignity with stronger requirements for care of unaccompanied children, including standards for medical care and medical emergencies, nutrition, hygiene and facilities, and personnel training. Strict conditions on influx shelters that house children would mandate compliance with requirements in the Flores settlement. Sponsors and potential sponsors would be safeguarded from DHS immigration enforcement based on information collected by HHS during the sponsor vetting process. Madam Speaker, we cannot be complicit in the crisis and suffering at the border. I urge support for this legislation and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from Texas.
Madam Speaker, I claim such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Almost 2 months ago, the administration sounded the alarm about the crisis at our southwest border and told the Congress additional funds were badly needed. Now, 2 months later, we're here. We have this border supplemental appropriations bill, H.R. 3401, that falls terribly short and will only further delay addressing the problem. I oppose this bill in its current form. Hundreds of thousands of people have arrived at the border this year. Some are coming through points of entry, and many are crossing through the desert or the Rio Grande. Men and women across agencies and departments have been working together to try to respond to the overwhelming surge of people coming to the border illegally. For the past 3 months, totaling over 100,000 people per month. Last month, topped that 144,000 men, women, and children from 51 countries. Our agents and officers, our volunteers, our non-governmental organizations are dealing with nearly 20,000 people in a space designed for a fraction of that. They're dealing with the increasingly hot summer heat, and they're dealing with migrants with grave medical conditions. This is a real crisis, and we need a bill that provides for all the agencies that are involved in responding, and it's long overdue. The bill before us does not provide Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Department of Defense, or the immigration courts with the funds they need. In addition, the bill includes provisions tying the administration's hands, including restrictions on foreign aid to Central American countries and stopping HHS from changing policies that could protect unaccompanied children. We're out of time, and some of our agencies are spending money they don't have because they have must-pay bills for contracts for food and shelter and transportation and medical care. I want everyone to be very aware of what they're dealing with. People are waiting in terrible conditions in the desert, and summer's here. Children are sleeping on the ground and need to be moved to shelters or homes. We need doctors and pediatricians. We need caregivers. We need immigration courts to rule in a timely manner. We should not force those who've submitted claims for asylum and other forms of relief to wait any longer. The more time we spend on partisan measures, the longer it will be before help arrives to those who desperately need it. We need to act now on a bipartisan solution, and I urge my colleagues to reject this bill that is partisan and dangerous. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I am delighted to yield 4 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Connecticut, the outstanding chair of the Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education Subcommittee, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlelady is recognized for 4 minutes.
Madam Speaker, we face a humanitarian crisis at our southern border, and we face a crisis of care. 6 children have died in U.S. custody in the last 9 months. In the 10 previous years, not one child died. These lost, scared, and vulnerable young people are so distraught in what the Miami Herald called, and I quote, prison-like facilities, that they are self-harming. It breaks our heart, and it must steel our conviction for action tonight. And we have been acting. In the 2020 Labor HHS Appropriations Bill, we strengthened protections for the Unaccompanied Children Program. These include funding legal services, blocking the administration's memorandum of agreement that had HHS erroneously prioritizing immigration enforcement over care for kids, and scaring sponsors from coming forward, and requiring the administration to abide by the protections that are guaranteed under the standards of care of the Flores Agreement. That is what we've done. This is what we are doing now. This emergency supplemental provides funding for the housing of children. It implements protections for them. It enacts mechanisms to ensure their safe and expeditious placement with sponsors. We provide legal services, child advocates, post-release services, additional federal field specialists, case management personnel to identify potential family sponsors and to discharge children to them as quickly as possible. The emergency supplemental provides the full amount of $2.9 billion requested by the administration. The full amount. These funds enable the department to expand its network of shelters to care for children. So we do provide the funds. However, we do not provide a blank check, because a blank check could be licensed to continue the abuses that we uncovered. All of us were shocked and outraged last year at the administration's intentional family separation policy, adding to the number of children that HHS had to care for, and doing so with no plan to reunify these families. The tragedy is some children will never be reunited with their families, and that is on this administration's watch. Along with these funds, this bill includes new and necessary protections. They redirect HHS to its core mission, which is to be caring for children, placing them in a safe environment with sponsors. This bill gives priority to small and medium-scale state licensed shelters wherever possible. And for the first time ever, it requires currently exempt influx facilities to meet the minimum standards of care required by the Flores settlement. If these grantees do not comply, their contracts are revoked. The bill limits the number of days children can spend at an influx shelter. A temporary facility should not become a near permanent way station. The bill requires HHS to maintain the directives that have been successfully accelerating the placement of children. And finally, the bill enhances transparency, provides adequate safeguards against the misuse of funds. It prohibits funds from being transferred outside of HHS. It does not give the Secretary discretion to decide which Flores protections should apply to influx shelters, and the bill requires HHS to report to the Congress within 24 hours if a child dies in HHS custody. Not one member in this body would volunteer his or her child or grandchild to be detained in these facilities. Not one of us would choose to expose our youngsters to these conditions. So we must not allow any children to continue to suffer, nor can we miss the opportunity to help. Thank you. President Franklin Roosevelt once said, quoting the poet Dante, and I quote, "Divine justice weighs the sins of the cold-blooded and the sins of the warm-hearted in different scales. Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference." We are not indifferent. We should not be indifferent tonight. Do not let us become frozen. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, let us pass this emergency supplemental bill because the lives of children are at stake, and we should not play fast and loose with their lives when we have the power to do something, to make a difference, and to protect these children and make sure they get to a safe haven and a safe landing. And I yield back.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank you, Ranking Member Granger. As the ranking member of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Appropriations, I know all too well the challenges we are facing on the border. I have the utmost respect for Chairwoman Roybal Allard and her work to address these issues and work with all the members of the subcommittee. At the time we crafted the fiscal year 2019 regular appropriations bill, we could not have predicted the sheer mass of people pouring across the border this spring and summer. But this fiscal year, Customs and Border Patrol have already encountered almost 700,000 people. That's double the amount in all the previous fiscal year, and we still have 3 months to go. Further, we are not talking about separating children. We are talking about children coming to this country without parents who can care for them. We can't just let kids wander the streets. We need to ensure that HHS has the space and the capacity to find sponsors or suitable homes for these kids. DHS cannot wait another month for funds, and DHS definitely cannot wait on Health and Human Services to receive more funds. We need a complete border supplemental bill providing relief and resources for all agencies working at the border and within the country to work through the number of migrants coming across the southern border. That includes immigration and customs enforcement, and that also includes the Department of Defense. Further, we need a supplemental bill that does not throw up roadblocks to implementing the aid we are trying to deliver. I urge the House to instead take up a more bipartisan bill that would also pass the Senate and get signed by the President on Friday. Time is of the essence. We need to work with the Senate and the President to get a bill enacted. Madam Speaker, I urge a no vote on this bill. Let's take up a bill that could deliver the humanitarian aid by the end of this week. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I am pleased to yield 4 minutes to the outstanding gentlewoman from California, the chairwoman of the Homeland Security Subcommittee, Ms. Roybal Allard.
Gentlelady is recognized for 4 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 3401. We have all seen the tragic pictures of immigrants held in extremely overcrowded CBP facilities, never designed to hold families and tender-aged children. I and many colleagues have been to the border and witnessed firsthand the horrific, indisputably untenable, and intolerable conditions. This bill addresses this humanitarian crisis and sets forth strong oversight provisions and requirements to ensure the basic humane care of migrants in custody, especially the children. Funding for the Department of Homeland Security totals nearly $1.5 billion, $150 million above the Senate committee bill. This crucial funding will directly address the humanitarian crises at the border by supporting temporary CBP holding facilities to relieve the dangerous overcrowding and by providing medical and transportation support, blankets, food, water, and other consumables for migrants. Combined with funding in Title III for unaccompanied children, the bill also provides resources needed to reduce time in CBP custody and to ensure their facilities are safe, sanitary, and humane. The bill also includes $200 million for an innovative multi-agency pilot program to better address the medical and legal needs of families and unaccompanied children. It will also improve the department's efficiency in migrant processing without compromising migrant legal protections. This pilot will collate Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Citizenship and Immigration Services, the Office of Refugees Resettlement, and nonprofit humanitarian organizations into a single facility. This will reduce overall processing time, provide consistent medical assessments and treatment, and offer legal orientation much earlier. Nonprofit organizations will provide assessments of migrants' needs and vulnerabilities and help families transition to local shelters or alternatives to detention. The bill also includes $60 million to help nonprofits and local jurisdictions continue their efforts to provide assistance to migrants released from DHS custody. The Office of Refugee Resettlement is nearly out of money. Without additional resources for sheltering capacity, children will continue to be held for weeks or longer in ill-equipped CBP holding facilities never intended to hold children for more than a few hours. Let me be clear. Without passage of this bill, the only alternative is the Senate bill, which has insufficient oversight provisions and leaves the door open for further abusive behavior by the administration. H.R. 3401 takes a constructive, balanced approach with the right mix of funding and oversight. Madam Speaker, Congress simply cannot adjourn without providing the funding needed to address the humanitarian crises and trauma of migrants and their children at the border. The only way to ensure the inclusion of strong oversight, compliance requirements, and priorities in the emergency supplemental package is to pass H.R. 3041. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the supplemental, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the ranking member for yielding. And Madam Speaker, I am truly saddened this evening to rise in opposition to what should be a humanitarian assistance bill for those who are suffering at our southern border. But for over 50 days, my Republican colleagues have been begging the House majority, begging to deliver badly needed relief to our agencies on the southern border who are overwhelmed by a record number of migrants. For over 50 days, the majority has remained silent while our agencies ran out of resources and migrant children suffered for lack of sufficient resources to properly care for them. The speaker talked about keeping America safe. Hardly. She said to vote for the children, the children, the children. At the same time, asking us to vote for a bill that withholds resources from the very agencies that are responsible for the care, custody, and control of those who are suffering at the border. Now, in response to, and I'm really glad, Madam Speaker, that finally the colleagues across the aisle have recognized this is a crisis at the southern border. It is not a manufactured crisis, as they claimed it was for over 2 months. But this bill does nothing to solve that crisis. It's nothing more than a political messaging bill for a large-scale disinformation campaign about that humanitarian crisis, which my colleagues across the aisle, again, once called a manufactured crisis. Specifically in this bill restricts DHS from sending additional employees to the southern border. Congress is now going to tell DHS how to deploy their staffing. Amazing. It withholds overtime funds for exhausted officers. It provides money, listen to this, it provides money to inspect DHS, but provides nothing. Can't use a dime to investigate human trafficking. When we know that these children that are suffering are being trafficked across that southern border. Not a dime to go after those traffickers. ICE has asked for 54,000 beds to handle this surge and alleviate the overcrowding, but the majority only gives them, in this bill, in the previous underlying bill, in appropriations, 34,000 beds, not 54,000 that they asked for, 34,000, and another 7,000 contingent. So the speaker and the majority they want to listen to the UN High Command on Refugees, but they do not want to listen to our own DHS agencies that are on that border responsible for care, custody, and control of those individuals. And finally, there's no funding for extra judges to help process more than 100,000 migrants per month. What we need is proper assistance, not political messaging. I spent my entire career, adult career, in law enforcement, and I know that giving money with burdensome strings is not leadership, and it's not the way to get things done. You have to allow the folks on the ground the flexibility to do their jobs. But we are simply wasting taxpayers' hard-earned money, and more importantly, wasting precious time. We have wasted 2 months as the situation at this southern border has only worsened. I can assure you that the agents on the ground have a better idea of what's needed to be done than Washington bureaucrats or the UN Commission. Unfortunately, there are many in this legislative body who despise our president so much that they're willing to suffocate our agencies with inadequate funding and regulations that endanger the safety of both migrants and our surrounding communities. And yet they're not just poking the president in the eye. With this bill, they are impairing our DHS men and women on the ground who are trying desperately,
Gentleman's time's expired.
30 seconds. Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
Who are trying desperately to manage this humanitarian crisis at the border. They're poking them in the eye also. Our ICE, DHS, and HHS employees provide care for every single man, woman, and child that crosses into our country. They deserve our support. What is needed is the resources to do their job effectively, and this bill does not provide that. It's frustrating to listen. So with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I am very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, the distinguished chairman of the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee, Mr. Serrano.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're now in the midst of a humanitarian crisis at the border created by the policies of the Trump administration. Like many of you, I have been shocked by the conditions at our border stations and the lack of basic services and necessities available to migrant families and especially to minors. This crisis has been aggravated by the anti-immigration policies of this president. He has once again created a disaster that has undermined our nation's standing in the world and our basic American values. No one should doubt why we are here today. But the question for me here is not who is at fault, but rather how do we as a body, how do we as a party respond? Because we have a responsibility to these children now. We have an obligation to these families now. They cannot wait. That is what this bill does. It provides the resources to alleviate the crisis. It ensures that we have the money to provide migrants, especially minors, with the shelter, food, medicine, and legal services that they need. The funding in this bill is not a blank check, however. The legislation includes numerous conditions to ensure this money is used for its intended purposes, to make sure that individuals are receiving the care and services they need, and to prevent the administration from creating further chaos and harm. This bill takes the right steps to address the crisis and to stop what the administration is doing. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. If we cry out against the crisis, then we have a responsibility to provide the funds to alleviate it. The bill does just that. I urge your support.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Madam Speaker, it's been 56 days since the Trump administration asked for emergency funding to address the humanitarian crisis at our southern border. 56 days. The New York Times gave 2 editorials, not 1, but 2. And Mexico is now sending 15,000 troops to the southern border. But Democrats, Madam Speaker, have rejected a bill to provide the aid that is needed. Not once, not twice, not even 10 times, but 18 times. Madam Speaker, I was shocked. I actually heard from the other side of the aisle, someone said there was a crisis. I guess after 56 days, they read some of those editorials. Now, after weeks of doing nothing and denying that a crisis exists, they're offering legislation that is misguided and is purely political. They're once again taking what should be a bipartisan issue and inserting partisan poison pills. I would say I would be shocked, but this isn't the only issue they've done that this year. Madam Speaker, they took a bill that had 100% vote from Republicans and Democrats dealing with prescription drugs, and before it got through the Speaker's office, Madam Speaker, it became political, a poison pill. They took a bill that was in Ways and Means that got every Republican and every Democrat to vote for it before, again, came to the floor. Another poison pill. So I guess we might have to get used to this, but the American public should not. You see, Madam Speaker, that isn't how it's being used on the other side of this building. You see, on the Senate, they actually took up this issue. They passed it out of committee 30-1. I know you might be shocked because I said that went through committee. I know you might be shocked because it said it was bipartisan. I know you might be shocked because they actually let the senators read the bill. You know, Madam Speaker, we're on this floor being sworn in. A lot of promises made, a lot of promises broken. You see, there was a rule change, 72 hours. It actually marked the number of hours. Last night I watched the Rules Committee. They were going to come before the Rules Committee with the bill that we did not see in committee. But you know what? They couldn't get the votes. So we had to say no to the Rules Committee. They'll come back at 10 o'clock. So I eagerly waited at 10. No, we could not come back. It's going to be at 11. Eagerly waited for 11. Did not happen. But luckily, politically, they got in the back of the room and they were able to buy off some more, Madam Speaker, in a political nature and rush something to the floor. I wondered if they were going to keep that rule that they championed so hard about 72 hours. Well, I don't know, maybe 5 equals 72. I'm not sure what math they keep nowadays. But let's talk about how they make this problem even worse. Because I'm not sure anybody's read the bill. I'm not sure even those on the other side know what's in it. Now here's how it's worse. Departments of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services cannot share information about the sponsors of children. Think about that for one moment. They're making sure two departments cannot share information within their own government. Now, this is necessary to ensure that children are not placed with human traffickers or with predators. Maybe you had a little time, maybe you didn't care about politics, you would allow a little sharing of information for the children. Organizations like Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Department of Justice are underfunded. Requests for pay and overtime costs for Border Patrol agents are denied. Think about that. In the last month, 144,000 people were apprehended coming across the border illegally. Unbelievable numbers. Have not seen that in decades. So what do the Democrats rush? Deny overtime. Deny the ability for those who are serving us the ability to work. And immigration judges do not get the resources they needed for additional staff or courtroom space or equipment. America is a country that believes in the rule of law. But I guess on this floor, it's not the case. You want to deny it. Now, I wonder that maybe, Madam Speaker, on the other side, they say, well, it's just so rushed to judgment. It's such a big bill. I didn't get to read it. But you know what? Earlier today, everyone in this chamber had the ability to vote for more funding for judges just to deal with this crisis. Because I've heard, Madam Speaker, on the other side of the aisle, you actually now use the word crisis. It only took 56 days. But lo and behold, when they had that moment, not to be confused, not to have a big bill, but only that subject, every single Democrat on the other side of the aisle except 7 said no. So you made sure you put in this political bill as well. Deny overtime during a crisis, because you said it was a crisis, but make sure nobody can work. You have a crisis, but make sure, Madam Speaker, that we can't have the judges down there, because somehow I guess maybe you don't believe in the rule of law. And additional funding to investigate human traffickers who you know are smuggling these children across the border is not included. Maybe that's why you want to rush this bill to the floor. Maybe that's why you don't want to give people an opportunity to read it. Because how will you answer that? How will you answer that additional funding to investigate human traffickers who are smuggling children you do not want to include?
You're an idiot.
Did you read the editorials? Is it wrong to prevent the administration from improving the welfare of unaccompanied children, as this bill will do? Democrats are far more interested in appearing to help children than in actually helping them. The pace and volume at which children have crossed our border over the last year have completely overwhelmed our existing resources.
You're
Madam
president.
Speaker, you're making sure that nobody could work overtime during this. In the first half of 2019, more than 56,000 unaccompanied children were apprehended by the Customs and Border Protection. That's a 74% increase from last year
That's your
and
president.
higher than the yearly totals for the last 5.
That's your president.
Luckily, someone finally realized that's a crisis, but made sure there's no money to deal with it. Health and Human Services, if Congress does not pass solutions. Now, HHS Secretary Alex Azar sent us a very clear message. Madam Speaker, this is what he said. I can't put a kid in a bed that does not exist. I cannot make a bed that Congress does not fund. And to think that you would knowingly pass something that causes this problem. Madam Speaker, Democrats are proud that their bill, unlike the Senate's, does not help our overstretched law enforcement officers.
Oh my God.
That is shameful. To take pride in making sure they do not get the help. Border Patrol agents now spend half of their time processing claims and caring for families in custody, including making trips to hospitals and clinics. They're going beyond the call of duty every day and deserve our support whether you like them or not. If the children who come across our southern border are to be properly cared for, Madam Speaker, Democrats' distrust of our national law enforcement officers must stop. Madam Speaker, it's been 56 days, but all Democrats threw together is a sham bill of more than 3 hours ago. It does not adequately fund what needed to be funded and would only make the crisis worse. Democrats are holding another vote late in the night on legislation that has no chance of becoming law. Madam Speaker, we are better than this. Madam Speaker, it's not very far. If you walk out these doors, you look down that hall, you'll see the other chambers. You know what happened in the other chambers? They worked a bill through committee. They worked a bipartisan bill through committee. They didn't run it to the floor in 3 hours. They didn't tell the Rules Committee to be ready and wait and wait and wait, and then quickly, after they cut a deal, on one side. They took something that is critical, something that is serious, and they acted that way.
Acted on it.
History will write about what happens on this floor. You may get emotional. You may be proud of your action, but the question will be, will history be kind to you? Question will be, when you voted that day, when you were sworn in, did you really mean 72 hours? When you stand on the floor and you speak of a crisis and you speak of caring for children, why would you not fund to make sure people are not trafficking them? When you spoke that there was a crisis on the border, why would you not fund the men and women who work for our government? Why would you try to deny them overtime?
Incredible.
Madam Speaker, I know the 4th of July is soon. And I know members want to get out of here. But America is more than a country. America is an idea of self-governance, an idea that the rule of law matters. This is not one of our finest moments. This is not one that I'm proud of. And what's so ashamed, Madam Speaker, is just a few yards away, they're showing us an example. Are you rushing because you're afraid the Senate's going to send us something that's bipartisan? Are you rushing because you're afraid the Senate will actually make law? There's a lot of things we could play political games with, but I never thought children would be the one you wanted to use. We are better than this. There is a moment in time where you should stand up to your own leadership.
We will.
There is a moment in time that you should stand up for this country.
We will.
There is a moment in time and this is it. You don't have to follow and be rushed. You can say no. I watched what the Senate has done. I watched people with my own philosophical belief, belong to my own party, work together with the other side and actually come to a bill that could become law. It's not perfect. It's not what I would agree with 100%. But you know what? I understand our government's designed to find compromise. I don't know what compromise is in this. I don't know who ever worked with another side. I don't know even who rushed it to the Rules Committee just to do some manager's amendments because you bought off a few people. This is not our finest moment by far. But Madam Speaker, there is a moment in time that individuals can stand up. And I'm hoping that the moment is tonight, that we actually stand for what this country believes and what we'll celebrate on the 4th of July. I yield back.
Members are directed to address their comments to the chair. Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, before I yield, I have great respect for the minority leader. But I ask Mr. Minority Leader, if not this bill, what bill can provide aid to these children? Where is this Senate bill, Madam Speaker? It is being held up by a Republican senator from the same state as the majority leader. Just let me finish and then I'd be delighted to yield. So I want to ask again, this bill is being held up by a Republican senator from the same state as the majority leader. So, Madam Speaker, a no vote on this bill by any member will ensure that children remain in absolute squalor. My colleagues, stop hiding behind a Senate bill that has not passed. I'd be delighted to yield.
Gentleman's recognized.
Lady for yielding, and I appreciate that. I've spoken to the leader on the Senate side, and they will bring it up tomorrow. And they had passed this bill in committee 30-1. I asked the gentlelady, what would be the problem? And I know we've only had 3 hours with this bill. Why would we not take up the Senate bill when it is bipartisan?
Mr. Minority Leader, I
President
had to reclaim my time
Yes.
because I want to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, a member of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Quinn.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the chairwoman for her leadership and the rest of the appropriators and the staff who were working very hard to get this emergency bill on the floor. This bill is important. I live on the border. I don't just go visit the border. And I've been to the CBP processing facilities. I've been to the nonprofit shelters for the immigrant children. I speak with the brave and compassionate men and women that are responsible for managing this humanitarian crisis. These men and women are my neighbors. And my neighbors, we have your back. They have expressed to me the urgency of getting this funding to enable them to protect the life and the safety of the migrants in their custody. But also, we must also keep in mind the communities that are also providing the food and the housing and the assistance that they need. Communities like Laredo, like McAllen, Texas, like San Antonio, and so many other communities across the southwest border. So we must pass this bill to provide that funding. But there's two particular provisions that I do want to mention also. One is the humanitarian reimbursements for communities, and the other is the one-stop processing centers that I had requested and has been added on this particular bill itself. Let me talk about the humanitarian care. You have cities, you have counties, you have churches, you have nonprofits that have really stepped up for many years. In fact, they started this work in 2014 when the first wave of children started coming up here. And this bill includes $60 million for the direct reimbursement for local communities and nonprofits in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. This funding will now use the different models. One, we set up a new pot of money to make sure that we get that funding. The second thing is this model provides the direct funding where the local communities can now ask for this requested monies. We had a different model back in 2014, and unfortunately, you had governors like my own state of Texas that got over $100 million and only provided $400,000 in the last 5 years. So this new funding will get the money directly to them. In fact, this funding will now be distributed to the Emergency Food and Shelter Program National Board, and they're required to distribute that money within 30 days after this board gets its money. So we have to provide that assistance to them because, again, they have to be reimbursed for food, water, medicine, medical supplies, temporary housing, and transportation. So that assistance has to be provided to the local entities. The second provision is this one-stop center, $200 million to make sure that this multi-agency integrated migration process, we get this. 30 seconds. We have to provide this because, again, the Border Patrol agencies cannot handle this, and therefore we need this particular processing center. Again, it's a good bill. Why should we wait for the Senate? Because we are the House of Representatives, and we have a right to pass our own bill and not wait for the Senate. And for those reasons, I say, let's support this bill. And with that time, Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, we have the right to pass a bill here in the House, as the gentleman just said. But we have the right to actually pass a good bill, not a political stunt. Why should we do this? I remember back in 2014, we're getting nostalgic in this place. Back in 2014, when the crisis began, and actually the crisis, the President Obama said there was a crisis, we all agreed. In fact, we have the majority stayed an extra week because we couldn't craft a bill. We finally crafted that bill, and it was a bipartisan bill that actually passed with both parties voting for it, and the money was delivered because we knew that it mattered. It was amazing to me just a few weeks on this floor, one of my colleagues came across, Madam Speaker, from Texas and said, we can't vote for the funding that the president has asked for. Give us some time to work it out and begin to work and make sure we get a good bill. Well, we've had a 5-hour bill. Is that time to work it out, Madam Speaker? Was that putting it all together and getting it right? Or was it actually lining up every constituency group and saying, did we get a little piece of this so we can go back home and show we're standing for something, while at the same time, Madam Speaker, ignoring our Border Patrol agents, ignoring those who put their lives on the line every day? Here's the problem. You know, it's amazing that we ignore. It's amazing to me, though, I will have to admit, I'm going to have to say one thing is actually good. I come to the floor tonight and actually hear there is a crisis on the border. Amazing. We've had progress. Let's all stand up and cheer. There's a crisis on the border. We've been saying it for months. The New York Times, the other media press said it finally, and finally it struck through that now we're saying there's a crisis on the border. I guess 132,000 people apprehended last month, 84,000 family unit members, 11,000 unaccompanied children, and 37,000 single adults apprehended. Maybe shows the time. The sheer volume increasing is amazing, but there's ways that we can fix this. We can give money. We can throw money at a problem and attach so many restrictions to it, Madam Speaker. The unfortunate part, this ain't funny. These are kids. These are families that are being perversely brought here by immigration laws that are broken. I can't get anybody to talk about that. I can't get the fact that our Flores settlement is forcing us into situations like the CBP is having to deal with and our Border Patrol agents because ICE doesn't have the beds. The majority leader pointed it out. You can't put people in beds that don't exist. But you also can't keep encouraging them to come across the border either, which is exactly what we're doing by having a Flores decision that they know that they can just get here. By the time that we're in this bill actually will not let us actually to look after the safety of those who are coming across because we can't share information. There's no safety. Do not vote for this bill thinking that you're putting safety in here because you're not, because over 3,000 simple members, Madam Speaker, 3,000 family units have been found to be fraudulent. There's a common knowledge that they're borrowing, renting, and buying children. It's there. But yet, that's what we want to do. We won't fix Flores. We won't fix our Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and we won't work on asylum and credible fear.
After months of claiming there was no problems, we offer this as an excuse. We offer this bill as something that won't fix it. It'll throw problems, in fact, won't become law. We won't do this because it's not working. We put every bit of what we want to do into not helping children, but actually putting restrictions on those who want to help. The CBP does not want to keep these children and these unaccompanied minors where they are. They don't want to keep asylum seekers from Cuba and keep them bottled up because they can't get their asylum here because they're having to process others. They don't want to do this. That's not their job. But this body and this job, we don't do ours because we simply keep overlooking the perverse incentive to come here. Because we're encouraging them. In fact, this body 2 weeks ago made another incentive with a Dreamer bill that has no hope of becoming law, but sends a clear signal to Central America and anywhere else, get here and you'll be fine. Get past the border and you'll be fine. It's frustrating to know that a bill that is humanitarian in aid could not even come to the floor within the last 24 hours without having to be rewritten and rewritten and rewritten because we didn't have enough of non-enforcement in there. We didn't have enough of other things in there that really doesn't make this applicable. You know, you just get to a certain point in time that HR 3401 even imposes conditions on the Office of Refugee Resettlement to Care for Children that they can't even operate temporary influx shelters as more and more accompanied aliens come in this country. They put severely limits on facilities such as BFD standards and compliance, and they're the only emergency situation we have right now. But we're ignoring that because we got to please somebody. As we go forward, I've said before on the floor of this House.
Gentleman's time,
30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
I'll end with this. And some people are going tonight, they're going to come down here and they're going to vote and they're going to feel good about themselves, Madam Speaker. But I'll tell you this, and I've said it before from this well. What makes you feel good does not heal you. Don't pretend, Madam Speaker, or anyone else who wants to vote for this, that you've solved something, that you've accomplished something, until you actually take the situation and say, why are they coming? How do we fix it? And how do we give the men and women what they need to fix this? When we look at that, if you walk away feeling good about yourself, it may be a time tonight, Madam Speaker, before we go to bed, look at yourself in the mirror and ask why. I yield back.
Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I am delighted to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Ohio, the chairwoman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee, Ms. Kaptur.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
I want to thank our able chairwoman, Nita Lowey of New York, for yielding me this time. And I come to the floor to urge my colleagues to support this emergency supplemental request to address the humanitarian cry on our southern border. Its aim is to save lives and health. All people of conscience know it is urgently needed. These funds are vital to ensure the health and safety of these migrant refugees and migrant children. A record number of desperate families and unaccompanied children have crossed into the United States, and our Border Patrol, Immigration Enforcement, and Office of Refugee Resettlement are simply overwhelmed. Just this week, we learned that 4 toddlers being held in a Border Patrol station in McAllen, Texas, had to be hospitalized because of dangerous neglect. The AP reported last week that children have been locked up in Border Patrol facilities for as many as 27 days without adequate food, water, and sanitation, for heaven's sake. This administration has failed to provide detained children with soap, toothbrushes, toothpaste, beds, and doesn't have the resources to adequately address flu and lice epidemics in these facilities. News reports say children are caring for other children in these facilities, and 5 children have died in Customs and Border Patrol custody since late last year. The situation is getting worse. Our nation needs a comprehensive continental diplomatic solution that acknowledges the economic and political conditions pushing Central American and Mexican communities to the brink, and the only option for desperation for these people is to flee north. We need comprehensive immigration reform that respects all continental laborers and migrants. President John F. Kennedy had a name for it. He called it the Alliance for Progress. But today, this Congress must meet the immediate need to provide financial support to end the humanitarian neglect confronting these travel-weary migrants. This $4.5 billion emergency spending will provide adequate support for key priorities: legal assistance, food, water, medical services, support services for unaccompanied children, alternatives to detention, and refugee services. Might I
Gentlelady's
request an
time
additional
expired.
15 seconds? I thank you,
Gentlelady's
gentlemen.
recognized for 30 seconds.
Most importantly, this spending correctly includes restrictions to hold this administration accountable and how it spends taxpayer dollars in a capacity that protects the rights and dignity of desperate people who happen to be migrants. I urge all my colleagues to support this life-saving supplemental. I want to thank Chairwoman Lowy for working so hard to bring this bill to the floor. I yield my remaining time back to her.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas rise?
I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank my friend from Texas. Madam Chair, I rise in strong opposition to this bill. For months, Republicans on and off the Homeland Security Committee have been highlighting the grave humanitarian crisis at our southwest border and pleading with House Democrats to take action. The Democrats' initial response was to deny the crisis even existed. And when that failed, they began to try to blame the president. The truth is, they've spent the past several months fighting amongst themselves on a way forward. Even as late as today, the Speaker had to intervene to stop the radical left in her caucus from sinking the bill. Meanwhile, the crisis has worsened. 144,000 immigrants in May alone were detained. 622% increase over the same month in 2017. Innocent children are being exploited by human smugglers. Border Patrol stations are overcrowded with thousands of migrants staying in poor conditions. These are in stations, Border Patrol processing centers, that have a maximum capacity of 4,000 people. We have 20,000 people in these facilities. For 8 weeks, the House Republicans have been trying to move my legislation to provide $4.5 billion in emergency aid requested by our president. But Democrats have blocked my bill from consideration on 18 separate occasions. Instead, they bring forward a bill today that isn't serious and has no chance of becoming law. To appease the radical left, this bill is stuffed with poison pills. For example, it includes nothing to stop innocent children from being exploited by human smugglers, nothing to continue DOD assistance, which has been essential for managing the crisis, and drastic restrictions on the Secretary's authority to surge personnel and assets to the border and update policies to improve conditions for migrant children. These poison pills will only exacerbate the crisis. They will ensure that dangerous catch and release policies continue unabated. Meanwhile, migrant families will continue to suffer at the hands of ruthless smugglers. Democrats had a real opportunity to work in a bipartisan manner to address this humanitarian crisis. Unfortunately, once again, they chose to appease the radical left and reject bipartisan consensus. I urge all members to vote against this bill. Then let's work together to craft a bipartisan border supplemental that can become law. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York.
Madam Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York, the chairman of the Democratic Caucus, Mr. Jeffries.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There is a humanitarian crisis at the southern border that should shock the conscience of every single American. These are migrant children being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment by our government. This is not Iran. This is not North Korea. This is not Venezuela. This is the United States of America. Shame on us. There are children who are without food. They are without medicine. They are without water. They are without soap. They are without diapers. They are without toothpaste. Shame on us. These are not alien children. They are God's children. This administration should stop using them as political pawns for some sick xenophobic game. Vote yes, and let's begin the process of ending this humanitarian crisis now. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the ranking member Granger.
We've been hearing for quite some time Democrats saying that the president and Republicans have not been coming to the table on this issue. What nonsense. For months, we have watched Democrats absolutely deny that there is a crisis. And I have actually on my desk a list, page after page after page of quotes from my colleagues who are denying a crisis at the border. Not only have Republicans for nearly 40 years, I mind you, been ringing the alarm on this issue, but we've been highlighting caravan after caravan after caravan coming to our southern border. Now, in May, we had 144,000 apprehended, nearly 700,000 to date. That number expected to go well over 1 million. Do we have a humanitarian crisis at the border? Yes. Do we have a security border crisis? Yes. But this bill does not adequately even fund ICE. It does not pay overtime for border personnel. 15 seconds.
Gentlelady yields 15 seconds.
It does not have any means to investigate human traffickers. It lacks funding for the Department of Justice immigration courts, and it ties the hands of the presidents to take action on securing our border. It's time for Democrats to come to the border, come to the table, and let's address this issue the way it ought to be addressed. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady from Texas and thank her for her leadership on this issue.